They called it the welcome ritual. But by the time the sun dropped behind the red hills, Ethan Cole was certain he had been brought here to face something he didn't understand and wouldn't survive. Before we go on, tell me where you're watching from, because out here stories travel farther than men ever do. And this one doesn't end the way you think. The wind carried dust through the canyon as Ethan stood with his hands loose at his sides. Not bound, not forced, which somehow made it worse, because no one had to push him forward. They simply watched, silent, as he stepped into the lodge. The fire inside was low, steady, throwing long shadows that moved like quiet witnesses along the curved walls, and the air smelled of smoke, sage, and something clean, like rain hitting dry earth after months without it. He had been taken just an hour before, just after he'd thought he was heading back to his small spread 10 miles west, just after the river, just after the moment that changed everything. He could still feel the weight of it in his arms, the pull of water, the sound of breath fighting to stay inside a body that wasn't ready to let it go. He hadn't asked who she was, hadn't thought about it, just acted, the way a man does when there's no time to think, only time to decide. And now here he was, boots dusty, shirt stiff with dried river water, standing in the center of a place no one like him was meant to stand. No one spoke. That was the first thing that settled heavy in his chest. Not anger, not threat, just silence, thick and deliberate, like every person in that room already knew something he didn't. A woman stepped forward, older, her face lined but steady, and she gestured, not commanding, just inviting, and Ethan didn't move at first, because he had lived long enough to know that invitations in places like this weren't always what they seemed. But then another figure moved behind him, not touching, just there, and he understood this wasn't a question. Slowly, he shrugged off his coat, dust falling in a thin cloud to the packed earth floor. Then his hat, placing it carefully on a nearby post like it still meant something where he was going. Hands reached out, not grabbing, not rough, just guiding, removing the weight of travel from his shoulders, the stiff fabric from his arms, the things that marked him as an outsider. And each movement was calm, practiced, as if they had done this many times before, just never for someone like him. Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning every face, looking for anger, for judgment, for anything he could understand. But there was none, only focus, only purpose. And that unsettled him more than any raised voice ever could. Warm water was brought in a shallow basin, steam rising in soft curls, catching the firelight, and when it touched his skin, it wasn't cold like the river had been. It was steady, careful, as if someone was making sure he stayed present, stayed aware, stayed alive. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest tightening instead of easing, because none of this fit, none of this matched the stories he'd heard. The warnings passed from one rancher to another across cracked wooden tables and long nights. Don't get taken, they'd said. And if you do, don't expect to walk back out. But no one had ever told him about this, about the quiet, about the way they looked at him not like prey, not like an enemy, but like something else entirely, something he couldn't name. A young woman stepped closer then, her movements light, precise, and for a moment their eyes met. And in that moment Ethan felt something shift, not fear, not relief, something deeper, something that made him stand a little straighter without knowing why. She painted a line across his arm, dark against his skin, then another across his chest, each stroke deliberate, each one placed like it mattered more than words ever could. He opened his mouth, finally, to ask, to demand, to understand, but the words caught somewhere between his throat and the weight of the room, because deep down, a part of him already knew. Whatever this was, it wasn't meant to be explained. It was meant to be endured, and just when the silence felt like it might swallow him whole, a voice came from the entrance, low, steady, cutting through everything without force, and every movement in the room stopped. Ethan turned, slow, instinct taking over, and saw her standing there, framed by the fading light outside, her presence pulling the air tight like a held breath. She didn't rush, didn't raise her voice, didn't need to, because every eye had already turned to her. And in that moment Ethan understood something simple and dangerous at the same time. This wasn't random. This wasn't chaos. This was something chosen. She stepped forward, stopping just a few feet from him, her gaze steady, searching, as if measuring something invisible, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "He doesn't understand," someone whispered behind him, barely audible, but enough. The woman's eyes never left his, and after a long moment, she said quietly, "That is why we begin." The air did not move after her words. It held, like the whole room had decided to breathe later, and Ethan stood there with the weight of water still in his bones and the weight of something else settling deeper, something he could not name, because nothing about this followed the rules he had lived by. 10 miles of open land, one horse, one man, and a sky that did not ask questions. That was the life he understood, not this place where silence spoke louder than threats and eyes carried meaning. Without a single word, the woman stepped closer, not hurried, not cautious, just certain, and that certainty pressed against him harder than any rope ever could, because it left him nothing to resist. Her name came to him without being offered, Ayanna, carried in the way others shifted around her, the way space made room before she even took a step, and he realized this was not a gathering. This was a moment that had been waiting for him before he ever knew it existed. "Stand," she said, and her voice was calm, steady, not an order, not a request, something in between that made refusing feel smaller than obeying. Ethan straightened, shoulders pulling back out of habit, the same way he had done in front of men who thought they owned more than they did. But this was different, because she was not measuring his strength, she was measuring something else, something quieter. The woman who had painted his arm moved again, this time slower, adding another line, then another, each mark placed with care, as if the space between them mattered as much as the lines themselves. And Ethan watched, not because he trusted it, but because he needed to understand what kind of ending this was leading toward. Outside, he could hear movement, not loud, not rushed, just the sound of many feet settling into place, and it spread through the ground before it reached his ears, a low vibration that told him he was no longer in a small room. He was in the center of something much larger. "You were at the river," Ayanna said, and it was not a question. Ethan nodded once, slow, his eyes never leaving hers, because something told him looking away now would mean missing the one moment that explained everything. "The current was strong," he answered, his voice rough from disuse, from the way silence had wrapped around him since they brought him here. She tilted her head slightly, studying him, not for the story, but for the truth inside it. "And you went in anyway," she continued. He let out a breath through his nose, something close to a dry laugh, but without the humor. "There was no time to think about it," he said. "You just move, or you do not." And for the first time, something in her expression shifted, not soft, not warm, but recognizing. The older woman beside him stepped back, leaving space between them, and that space felt heavier than when she had been close, because now there was nothing between Ethan and whatever this was becoming. Ayanna reached down and picked up something from beside the fire, a small object wrapped in worn leather, and when she held it out, he hesitated, not from fear, but from the sense that taking it meant crossing a line he could not step back from. "Take it," she said quietly. He did, his fingers closing around the leather, feeling the shape beneath it, something smooth, something worn by time and touch, and when he unwrapped it, the firelight caught a small stone set in silver, simple, unpolished, but carrying a weight that had nothing to do with size. "She carried this," Ayanna said, her voice lower now, closer to something personal. "Before the river tried to take her." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, the memory returning sharper, the way her hand had slipped once, just once, and how that had been enough to tell him what losing looked like. "I did not save anything," he said, almost under his breath. "I just did what anyone would do." A quiet murmur moved through the room at that, not disagreement, not approval, just something acknowledging the words without accepting them. Ayanna stepped closer again, close enough that the space between them felt deliberate, and she shook her head once slow. "No," she said, "not anyone." The words settled into him, not loud, not forceful, but it stayed, the way truth does when it finds a place that has been empty longer than a man realizes. Outside, the sound shifted, not louder, but clearer, and Ethan understood now that they were waiting, not for a decision, not for a command, but for this moment to finish unfolding. You think this is something being done to you? Ayana continued, her eyes steady, holding his. That you were brought here to face something you cannot stop. Ethan did not answer, because that had been exactly what he thought from the moment they found him. She let the silence stretch just long enough to let that settle, then said, "You are here because something has already been done, and it cannot be undone." His grip tightened slightly around the stone, not enough to show, but enough that he felt it. And for the first time since stepping into that lodge, the fear shifted, not gone, not replaced, just changed, as if it no longer pointed forward, but inward. The fire cracked softly, a small sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and Ayana stepped back half a pace, giving him space, not as a release, but as a recognition. "When a life is returned," she said, her voice carrying now, reaching beyond him, beyond the walls. "We do not pretend it was nothing." The words moved through the room, through the ground, and out into the waiting silence beyond, and Ethan realized then that whatever came next, it was not going to be what he had feared, and that made it all the more dangerous, because he had no idea what it meant to be seen this way. He looked down at the stone in his hand, then back up at her, and for the first time, his voice carried something other than resistance. "Then what happens now?" he asked, slow, careful, as if the answer mattered more than anything he had asked in a long time. Ayana held his gaze, and in her eyes there was no threat, no judgment, only something steady and unyielding. "Now," she said, "you understand why they are waiting outside." The moment she said it, the weight of the outside world pressed in, not as noise, but as presence, and Ethan felt it in the soles of his boots before he heard it. Dozens, maybe more, standing just beyond the thin walls, waiting without impatience, waiting without doubt. And that kind of waiting unsettled him more than any threat ever had, because it meant they already knew how this would end. He looked at Ayana, searching for something to anchor himself to, some sign that this was still a situation a man could control, but her expression did not change, steady as the land itself. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan understood he was not the one deciding what came next. "Outside," she said, not turning, not needing to. "They have been there since before you entered," and her voice carried the kind of certainty that made questions feel unnecessary. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the leather in his hand warming from his grip, the small stone inside it pressing into his palm like it was reminding him that this was real, that this was not something he could wake up from when morning came. "All of them?" he asked, quieter now, not from fear, but from the realization that whatever waited outside was not meant to intimidate. It was meant to witness. Ayana gave a small nod, her eyes still on him, measuring, not judging. "All who needed to see," she answered. The words settled in the space between them, and Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not panic. Not yet. Something closer to standing at the edge of a drop you did not know was there until your foot found empty air. The older woman who had been guiding him stepped back completely now, joining the others along the wall, and the space around Ethan opened, leaving him alone in the center, not isolated, but placed. The fire cracked again, sending a brief flicker of light across the painted lines on his skin, and for a moment, he caught his reflection in a piece of polished metal hanging near the entrance, and he did not look like the man who had ridden out that morning. He looked like someone marked for something he had not agreed to. "You think you saved a life," Ayana continued, her tone even, almost gentle, "and then you walked away." Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in thought, because that was exactly what he had done, pulled her from the river, made sure she could stand, then turned back toward his horse, toward his land, toward the life he understood. "That is how it works," he said, his voice steady. "You help, then you go on." A faint shift moved through the room at that, not disagreement, not quite, but something like recognition of a truth that only belonged to one side of the world. Ayana stepped closer again, just enough to bring him fully into her focus. "Not here," she said. The words were simple, but they carried something heavier than explanation. Ethan held her gaze, the silence stretching again, but this time it did not feel empty. It felt like something building. "Here," she went on, "when a life is returned. It does not belong only to the one who was saved, and it does not belong to the one who reached into the water. She paused, letting that settle, letting him follow it. It belongs to the space between them. Ethan frowned slightly, not confused, but working through it, the way a man does when something does not fit the shape of what he knows. And what does that mean for me? He asked. Ayana did not answer right away, and that pause carried more weight than any immediate response could have, because it meant the answer was not simple, not something handed over without cost. Finally, she turned slightly toward the entrance, and the shift was enough to change the air in the room, because now the focus was no longer just between them. It was expanding outward. It means, she said quietly, you do not walk away unseen. The words landed with a quiet finality, and before Ethan could respond, before he could ask what that truly meant, one of the figures near the entrance moved, lifting the woven flap just enough to let the outside light spill in, and with it came the sound, not loud, not sudden, but undeniable, the presence of many people standing in stillness. Ethan turned, slow, deliberate, and what he saw stopped him in a way no sudden movement ever could. The open space beyond the lodge stretched wide. Under the fading sky, the red earth cooling as the last light settled across it. And there, filling that space, were rows of figures, men, women, elders, all standing in quiet formation, their attention fixed on the entrance, on him. No one spoke, no one moved, and that stillness carried more weight than any crowd he had ever seen, because it was not driven by curiosity or spectacle, it was driven by something deeper, something shared. Ethan felt his breath slow, not by choice, but because the moment demanded it, because anything louder would have felt out of place. They are not here to judge you, Ayana said behind him, her voice steady, grounding. They are here because they must see. Ethan did not turn back right away, his eyes taking in the rows, the quiet, the way even the wind seemed to move around them instead of through them, and for the first time, the fear that had been sitting in his chest since the river shifted again, not gone, but changing shape, becoming something else, something heavier but clearer. See what? He asked, barely above a whisper. Ayana stepped beside him now, standing just within his line of sight, not in front, not behind, but beside, equal in the space they now shared, and she looked out at the gathered people before answering. The man who did not turn away, she said. The words were simple, but as they settled into him, Ethan felt something he had not felt in years. Not pride, not relief, something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The silence held again, deeper now, and then, slowly, one figure in the front row lowered to one knee, not rushed, not forced, just deliberate, and another followed, and another, until the movement spread through the crowd like a ripple across still water, and Ethan stood there, unmoving, as the meaning of it began to reach him, not all at once, but enough to know this was not the end of anything. This was the beginning of something he had never expected to carry. The last man to lower himself did not rush, and that was the part Ethan felt the most, not the number of them, not the sight of 100 figures kneeling in the fading light, but the patience in it, the certainty, like each movement had already been decided long before he ever stepped into that canyon. He stood there, the small stone still pressed into his palm, the marks on his skin catching the last of the sun, and for a moment he did not know what to do with his hands, with his breath, with the weight of being seen by that many eyes without a single word spoken. They do not bow to you, Ayana said quietly beside him, her voice steady, grounding. They bow to what passed through you. Ethan swallowed once, slow, his gaze moving across the line of people, old faces, young faces, some worn by years, some still untouched by them, all carrying the same quiet recognition that he could not return or refuse. I did not ask for this, he said, not as a protest, not even as a complaint, just stating something that felt important to hold on to. Ayana nodded once, a small movement, acknowledging the truth in it without changing anything. No one does, she answered. The wind shifted slightly then, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant water, and Ethan felt it brush against his face like a reminder that the world outside this moment still existed. that there were fences and cattle and long miles of empty land waiting for him if he chose to walk away. But the thought did not settle the way it used to. It hovered, uncertain, like it no longer fit the shape of what he was standing in now. One of the elders in the front row lifted his head slightly, not rising, just enough to meet Ethan's eyes, and there was no demand in that look, no expectation, just a quiet offering of something that did not need to be named. Ethan shifted his weight, boots pressing into the packed ground, and for the first time since this began, he felt the instinct to step back, not out of fear, but out of the overwhelming sense that he had been placed somewhere he did not belong. He took half a step, barely noticeable, but enough that Ayana's voice reached him again, soft but clear. "If you leave now, nothing will stop you." The words hung there, simple, undeniable, and Ethan froze in that half step, because freedom had never sounded like this before. It had never felt like something that came with weight instead of relief. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see her from the corner of his eye. "And if I stay?" he asked. Ayana did not answer right away, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything he needed to understand before she spoke. "Finally," she said. "Then you accept what has already begun." Ethan looked back out at the kneeling figures, the stillness, the quiet that stretched farther than he could measure, and something inside him shifted again, not forced, not sudden, just settling, like a piece falling into place after a long time of not knowing where it belonged. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a way that felt different from before, less guarded, less prepared to run. The stone in his hand felt heavier now, not in weight, but in meaning, and without thinking, he closed his fingers around it fully, not holding it like something temporary, but like something that had been given with intention. The elder in the front row lowered his head again, not deeper, just enough to complete the gesture, and the movement rippled through the others, not changing their position, but deepening the silence around them. "What happens to her?" Ethan asked suddenly, the question rising from a place he had not expected, pulling him back to the river, to the moment that had started all of this. Ayana followed his gaze for a brief second, then returned her attention to him. "She lives," she said simply, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just truth. Ethan nodded once, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, and for the first time, the memory of the river did not come with the sharp edge of what could have been. Lost, it came with something steadier, something complete. Ayana stepped forward then, just one step, placing herself fully beside him, equal in the space that had formed between him and the gathered people, and she raised her hand slightly, not high, not commanding, just enough to signal something that did not need explanation. Slowly, one by one, the figures before them began to rise, not all at once, not in unison, but in a quiet sequence that felt more like breath returning than movement. Beginning, Ethan watched, his chest tightening again, but not with fear, with the realization that whatever this was, it was not ending. It was shifting, moving into something else. "You will leave here," Ayana said, her voice low, steady. "But you will not leave as you arrived." Ethan let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "I was hoping you would say I could just ride out and forget all this," he said. Ayana's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel it. "You can try," she replied. The honesty in it caught him off guard, and for a moment, that almost unsettled him more than everything else that had happened. He looked down at his hands, at the lines painted across his skin, at the stone resting in his palm, then back out at the people who had risen to stand before him. And he understood something simple, something that did not need words to explain it, something that would follow him long after he left this place. Out here, a man could ride for days and never be seen, never be known, never be remembered. But this was different. He shifted his stance again. Not back this time, but forward, just enough to close the space he had almost stepped away from. And Ayana saw it, though she said nothing. The sun dipped lower behind the hills, the last light stretching long across the ground. And in that quiet moment between day and night, Ethan Cole stood in a place he had never meant to find, holding something he had never meant to carry. And for the first time in years, he did not feel like a man passing through. He felt like someone who had been stopped. For a reason, even if he did not yet understand what that reason would ask of him next. The last of the lights slipped behind the ridge, and with it the world seemed to quiet in a way that Ethan had never known before, not empty, not still, but settled, like everything had found its place for the night except him. The people stood now, no longer kneeling, yet the weight of what had just happened did not lift, it stayed in the air, in the ground, in the way no one turned away from him, and that was the part he could not shake, because he had spent most of his life being unseen, riding past towns where no one remembered his name, working land that did not ask who he was, and now every eye here carried something he had not earned in the way he understood earning. He shifted the stone in his hand, feeling its edges, the smoothness worn by time, and for a moment he thought about giving it back, about placing it down and stepping away before whatever this was settled too deep to leave behind. But his fingers did not open, they tightened instead, as if something in him had already decided. "You are thinking about leaving," Ayanna said beside him, her voice low, not accusing, not surprised, just certain. Ethan let out a breath through his nose, a faint trace of a smile without humor touching his face. "That obvious?" he asked. She did not answer with words, only a slight tilt of her head, and that was enough. He looked out past the people now, past the edge of the gathering, to where the land stretched into shadow, where his horse would be tied, where the trail would still be there waiting for him like it always had, simple, familiar, asking nothing more than miles and time. "Out there," he said slowly. "Things make sense, you do what needs doing, and then you keep moving." Ayanna followed his gaze for a moment, then looked back at him. "And does it stay with you?" she asked. The question caught him off guard, not because it was hard, but because it was simple in a way he had not expected. He thought about it, about the days that blurred together, the work, the quiet, the long rides where the only sound was the rhythm of hooves and wind, and he realized he did not have an answer that fit the way she was asking. "No," he said finally, honest in a way that felt unfamiliar. "Most things do not." Ayanna nodded once, as if that confirmed something she already knew. "That is why this is different," she said. The words settled into him, not heavy, not light, just present. One of the elders stepped forward then, slow, deliberate, his movements carrying the weight of years, and he stopped a few feet away from Ethan, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to ignore, and he raised his hand slightly, palm open, a gesture that did not ask, but offered. Ethan looked at it, then at the man's face, searching for something to guide him, and found only calm, steady patience. Slowly, he mirrored the motion, lifting his own hand, the one that held the stone, and for a brief moment the two gestures met in the space between them, not touching, just aligned, and something in that alignment felt more binding than any grip ever could. The elder lowered his hand, then stepped back without a word, returning to his place. And the quiet that followed was not empty. It was full of acknowledgement, of something past without needing to be named. Ethan let his hand fall back to his side, the stone still there, still warm now, and he realized that whatever this was, it was not about being thanked, it was not about being praised, it was about being seen and then held to that. "You will carry this," Ayanna said, her voice softer now, almost reflective, "not because we ask you to, but because it is already yours." Ethan glanced down at the markings on his skin, then back at her. "And what does that mean when I ride out of here?" he asked. She met his gaze, steady as ever. "It means you will not pass through the world the same way again." He huffed quietly, a breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "That sounds like more trouble than I was planning on," he said. Ayanna's expression shifted just slightly again, that almost smile returning for a moment. "It usually is," she replied. The honesty of it settled something in him, not easing it, but making it real. The night began to take hold then, the sky deepening, the first stars pushing through the fading blue, and one by one small fires were lit around the edges of the gathering. Not bright, not overwhelming, just enough to hold the dark at a respectful distance. The people began to move now, not dispersing, not leaving, but shifting into a rhythm that felt natural, like the end of something and the beginning of something else happening at the same time. Ethan stood where he was, unsure for a moment if he was meant to stay or go. If there was another step he was supposed to take, or if this was the place where he chose his own direction. Ayana watched him, not guiding, not pushing, just present, and that presence was enough. He looked once more toward the edge of the camp, toward the unseen trail that led back to everything he had known, then back at the people, at the firelight catching their faces, at the quiet way they moved. And he felt that shift again, deeper now, settling into something he could not ignore. He took a step, not away this time, but forward, into the space where the fires burned low and the night waited, and as he did, the weight in his chest did not lift, but it changed, becoming something steadier, something that did not press down, but held him upright. Behind him, Ayana did not follow right away, and she did not need to, because this step, this one, belonged to him alone. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Cole was not just moving forward out of habit. He was stepping into something that had already begun to shape him, whether he chose to understand it or not. The firelight moved slow across the ground as Ethan stepped deeper into the camp, and the sound of the world shifted with him, quieter in some places, fuller in others, like he had crossed an invisible line that separated being a stranger from being something else he could not yet name. The people did not crowd him, did not press in or pull away. They simply made space, and that space followed him like a path already cleared, not out of fear, not out of respect the way he had seen in towns, but something steadier, something that did not rise or fall with what a man owned or how loud he spoke. He stopped near one of the smaller fires, the heat brushing against his hands, and for a moment he just stood there, letting it settle, letting himself feel where he was instead of trying to understand it all at once. The stone in his palm had warmed fully now, no longer foreign, no longer something handed to him, but something he had not put down, and that thought stayed with him longer than he expected. A child moved past him then, no more than 10, carrying a small bundle of wood, and as the boy passed, he glanced up at Ethan, not with curiosity, not with fear, but with something simple and clear, recognition, and then he kept walking, adding the wood to the fire without a word. Ethan watched him for a second longer than necessary, then looked away, his jaw tightening slightly, because that look had not asked anything of him, but it had given something all the same. You are still trying to measure it. Ayana's voice came from behind him, quiet, but close enough to feel. He did not turn right away, his eyes still on the fire. That obvious too? He asked, the edge of dry humor returning just slightly. She stepped beside him again, matching his pace, his stillness. You are counting what it costs, she said. Ethan let out a slow breath, the truth in that landing without resistance. That is how you survive out there, he replied, nodding toward the dark edge of the land beyond the fires. You figure what something costs before you carry it. Ayana watched the fire for a moment, the flames reflecting in her eyes, steady, unhurried. And what does this cost? She asked, the question settled, heavier than the others had, because it was not something he could answer with distance or habit. Ethan shifted his weight, rolling the stone once in his palm, feeling its shape, its presence. I do not know yet, he said finally. She nodded once, accepting that. Then do not decide too soon, she answered. The night deepened around them, the sky stretching wide and clear, stars sharp against the dark, and the fires across the camp flickered in quiet rhythm, each one holding its own circle of light without trying to compete with the others. People moved between them, not in a rush, not in silence, but in a way that felt balanced, like each step had its place and did not need to be explained. Ethan found himself watching them, not out of caution, but because he could not quite look away, because there was something in the way they existed together that did not match the world he had come from, where every man stood alone even in a crowd. An older woman approached then, carrying a small bowl, steam rising from it in thin curls, and she held it out to him without a word. Ethan hesitated for half a second, then reached out, taking it carefully, the warmth settling into his hands immediately. He looked up at her, expecting something, a nod, a signal, anything that told him what this meant, but she only met his eyes briefly, then stepped back, leaving him with it. He glanced at Ayana, a question there without needing to speak it, and she gave a small nod. Eat, she said simply. Ethan looked down at the bowl, then back at the fire, then took a slow breath and did as she said. the warmth spreading through him in a way he had not realized he needed until it was there. The act was simple, nothing more than a man eating after a long day, but here, in this place, it carried something else, something that made him aware of every movement, every breath, every moment he remained. "You think this ends when you leave," Ayana said after a while, her voice quieter now, almost blending with the crackle of the fire. Ethan swallowed, then glanced at her. "Does it not?" he asked. She shook her head slightly, her gaze still on the flames. "It follows you," she said. The words were not heavy, not threatening, but they stayed, settling into him in a way that made him understand she was not speaking about the people, not about the place, but about something inside him that had already shifted. He leaned back slightly, resting his weight on his heels, looking out across the camp again. The fires, the movement, the quiet presence of everyone there. And for the first time, the thought of leaving did not come with the same clarity it had before. It came with a question. "And what if I do not want it to follow?" he asked, not challenging, just asking. Ayana turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes again, and there was something in her gaze now that had not been there before, not stronger, not softer, just more certain. "Then you will learn how far a man can ride from himself," she said. The answer settled into him slowly, not immediate, not sharp, but deep, like something that would take time to fully understand. Ethan looked down at the empty bowl in his hands, then at the stone still resting in his palm, then back at the fire, and he realized something that he could not quite explain yet, something that did not need to be spoken to be true. This was not about where he would go next, it was about what he would carry when he got there, and whether he chose it or not, that part had already begun. The fire burned lower now, not fading, just settling into a steady glow, and Ethan sat with his elbows resting lightly on his knees, the empty bowl beside him, the stone still in his hand, turning it slowly without thinking, like a habit he had not chosen but had already begun. The sounds of the camp moved around him in quiet layers, low voices, the soft crackle of wood, the occasional shift of footsteps against dirt. Nothing sharp, nothing demanding, just life continuing in a way that did not need to be announced. He had spent years in silence. But this was different. This was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of presence, and that distinction stayed with him longer than he expected. Across the fire, the same child from earlier sat now, watching the flames with a focus that seemed too steady for someone his age, and after a moment, the boy looked up again, meeting Ethan's eyes briefly, then nodding once, small, almost unnoticeable, before returning his gaze to the fire. Ethan blinked, just once, as if to clear it, because he did not understand what that nod meant, and somehow that made it feel more important than if he did. He shifted slightly, leaning back, his shoulders loosening just enough to feel the weight he had been carrying all day begin to settle into something less sharp, less immediate. "You are quieter now," Ayana said from his side, her voice low, almost blending with the rhythm of the fire. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing at her without fully turning. "Not sure if that is a good sign or a bad one," he replied. She did not answer right away, and when she did, her voice carried a softness that had not been there before. "It means you are listening." He let that sit. The words simple, but they reached further than he expected, because listening had never been something he thought about. It had always been something he did only when necessary, when survival depended on it, not when meaning did. He looked back at the fire, watching the way the flames moved without pattern but never without purpose, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to figure everything out. All at once. "Earlier," he said after a moment, his voice steady but quieter than before, "you said this does not belong to me, or to her, but to the space between." Ayana nodded slightly, her eyes following the same flames. "Yes." Ethan rolled the stone once more between his fingers, feeling its edges, its history. "And that space follows me?" he asked. She turned her head just enough to look at him directly. "It stays where it was made," she said, then paused, letting that settle before adding, "But you carry the knowing of it." He frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in the effort of understanding something that did not fit into the kind of answers he was used to. "And what am I supposed to do with that?" he asked. Ayana's gaze held his for a moment longer, then shifted back to the fire. "You do not decide that tonight," she said. The certainty in her voice did not close the question. It simply placed it somewhere he could not reach yet, and for once, that did not frustrate him the way it might have before. A breeze moved through the camp then, light, carrying the scent of sage and ash, brushing against his face, and Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, letting it pass, letting himself feel where he was instead of trying to place it. When he opened them again, the sky above had deepened fully into night, the stars sharp and countless, stretching farther than any fence line he had ever known. And for a moment, the thought crossed his mind that he had spent years riding under that same sky without ever really seeing it. Do they all know? He asked suddenly, his voice low, almost hesitant. Ayana followed his gaze upward, then back across the camp. They know what happened, she said. And they know what it means. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing that. The idea of so many people holding the same understanding without needing to speak it out loud. Back where I come from, he said. Things like this do not stay quiet. Ayana's lips curved. Just slightly again, that familiar almost smile. That is why it does not stay there, she replied. The truth in it was simple, undeniable, and Ethan felt it settle somewhere deeper than thought. The child across the fire stood then, brushing dust from his hands, and without looking back, he stepped away into the darker edge of the camp, disappearing between the low shapes of the lodges and the shifting light of other fires. Ethan watched him go, then looked back at the place he had been sitting, the empty space left behind, and something about it felt intentional, like a quiet reminder that moments moved on whether a man was ready or not. You will rest here tonight, Ayana said after a while, her tone leaving no room for question, but carrying no force either. Ethan nodded once, not out of obligation, but because it felt like the only thing that made sense in a place where nothing had followed the rules he knew. He leaned back slightly, stretching his legs out toward the fire, the warmth settling into him. And for the first time since the river, since the moment everything shifted, he felt something close to stillness, not empty, not distant, but present. The stone remained in his hand, and without thinking, he slipped it into his pocket, not as a decision, not as a promise, just as something that felt right in the moment. Ayana saw the movement, though she said nothing, and that silence carried its own kind of acknowledgement. The fire cracked softly again, sending a small burst of sparks into the night, and Ethan watched them rise and fade, brief, bright, and gone, and he realized that not everything needed to last to matter. Some things only needed to happen to change what came after. He drew a slow breath, letting it out just as steady, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was not thinking about where he would be in the morning. He was simply where he was, and that, more than anything else, told him that whatever had begun here was not something he could leave behind by riding far enough or fast enough. It was something that had already found its place inside him, whether he understood it yet or not. The night stretched long, but it did not feel heavy, and that was the first thing Ethan noticed as he sat by the dying fire, the warmth fading slow instead of all at once, like the day had not ended but simply stepped aside. He had slept in harsher places, under colder skies, with less reason to close his eyes, but this was different, because even in rest, something in him stayed awake, not alert, not tense, just aware, like a part of him had been shifted into a place where it could not return to what it had been before. He lay back eventually, using his rolled coat as a pillow, staring up at the wide stretch of sky, the stars clear and countless, and for the first time in years, he did not measure distance or direction, did not trace routes in his head or count miles left to ride. He simply looked, and that simple act felt unfamiliar enough to hold his attention. Somewhere nearby, a low voice carried, not speaking to him, not meant for him, just part of the night moving as it always did, and he realized something quiet and steady. He was no longer outside of it. His hand rested near his side, fingers brushing the pocket where the stone sat, and even without touching it directly, he felt its presence, not as weight, but as something constant, something that did not need to be checked to be known. Sleep came slow, not because he could not rest, but because his mind did not move the way it used to. It did not circle back to the same thoughts, did not chase the same paths. It simply settled, piece by piece, until the silence inside him matched the silence around him. When morning came, it did not arrive with urgency. It came soft, a gradual shift of light over the hills, a cooling breeze turning warm again, and the quiet sounds of the camp returning, not waking, but continuing. Ethan opened his eyes without rushing, the ground firm beneath him, the air carrying that same scent of sage and dust, and for a moment, he did not move, letting the day begin without him before he stepped into it. He sat up slowly, rolling his shoulders once, the stiffness there but lighter than he expected, and when he reached into his pocket, his fingers closed around the stone without hesitation, as if it had always belonged there. Across the camp, people were already moving, not in preparation, not in urgency, just in rhythm, the same quiet purpose that had been there the night before. A man passed by carrying water, another tending a small fire, a woman speaking softly too. A child, and none of it paused for him, none of it adjusted, and somehow that felt more welcoming than if it had. He stood, brushing dust from his clothes, the marks on his skin still faintly visible, not as bold as they had been by firelight, but not gone either, and he understood then that some things did not fade with the night. They remained, quieter perhaps, but present. Ayanna approached from the far side of the camp, her steps measured, unhurried, and when she reached him, she did not speak right away. She simply stood there, looking at him the way she had from the beginning, not searching, not questioning, just seeing. Ethan gave a small nod, the kind a man gives when there are no words that fit the moment, and after a second, he spoke. "Morning comes the same everywhere," he said. Ayanna tilted her head slightly, considering that. "Does it?" she asked. Ethan glanced around, at the camp, the people, the way everything moved without needing to be explained, and then out, toward the distant land beyond, where his trail waded somewhere past the hills. "Feels different here," he admitted. Ayanna nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement. "Because you are not the same as you were yesterday," she said. The words landed simply, without weight, but they stayed, settling into him the same way everything else here had, without force, without demand. He looked down briefly, then back at her. "And today?" he asked, not meaning the time, but what came with it. Ayanna did not answer right away, and that pause carried meaning, as it always did with her. "Today," she said finally, "you decide which part of you leaves." Ethan let out a slow breath, the question sharper than the others, because this one did not sit in the distance, it stood right in front of him. He turned slightly, looking toward where his horse would be, where the open land began again, and for a moment, the old instinct rose, clear and familiar. Saddle up, ride out, leave before anything could take hold. But the thought did not carry the same certainty it once had. It did not feel like the only path forward. It felt like one choice among others, and that alone was enough to make him pause. "You could have stopped me," he said after a moment, his voice steady. "Last night, when I stepped forward, when I stayed." Ayanna shook her head slightly. "That step was yours," she said, "just as the next one will be." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding settling in without resistance this time, because he could feel it, the difference between being pushed and choosing to move. He reached into his pocket again, pulling out the stone, turning it once in the morning light, the surface catching just enough of the sun to reflect it back. Simple, unpolished, but carrying something that did not need to be seen to be understood. He held it there for a moment, then closed his hand around it again, not deciding, not yet, but not ignoring it either. The camp continued around them, steady, unchanged, and Ethan stood in the middle of it, not as a stranger anymore, but not fully as one of them either, something in between, something that did not need to be named to be real. The sun rose higher, the light stretching across the land, and with it came the quiet certainty that whatever he chose next would not erase what had happened here. It would only reveal what kind of man he had become because of it. The morning did not rush him, and that was what made the decision heavier than any urgency ever could, because there was no pressure, no voice telling him what to do. Only the quiet unfolding of another day and the understanding that whatever he chose would be his alone. Ethan stood at the edge of the camp now, where the packed ground gave way to open land, where the faint trail of his arrival still marked the dust, leading out toward the wide stretch of hills and dry valleys he knew like the back of his hand. His horse waited there, reins tied loosely to a low branch, head lowered, calm, as if nothing had changed, as if yesterday had been no different from any other day. He walked toward it slowly, boots pressing into the earth with each step, and with every foot of distance he put between himself and the camp, something inside him shifted, not pulling him back, not pushing him forward, just reminding him that leaving was no longer simple. He reached the horse and rested his hand along its neck, feeling the familiar warmth, the steady breath, and for a moment, everything felt the way it always had, clear, predictable, a man and his path laid out in front of him without complication. He untied the reins, the rope sliding free with a soft sound, and the horse lifted its head slightly, ears flicking, ready to move when he was. Ethan stood there, holding the leather loosely, and looked out toward the horizon, the land stretching miles and miles. Nothing but space and sky and the promise of distance. And it should have felt like freedom. It always had. But now, it felt incomplete, like something had been left behind even though he had not taken a single step away yet. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady but heavier than it should have been, and his hand drifted to his pocket, fingers brushing the stone without pulling it out. You already know. Ayana's voice came from behind him. Not close, not far. Just there. Ethan did not turn right away, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Feels like I should, he answered, but it does not come easy. Ayana stepped up beside him, her gaze following his out across the land. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence settling between them the same way it had since the beginning, not empty, but full of everything that did not need to be said. Out there, she said after a while. You move because there is always somewhere else to go. Ethan nodded slightly. The truth of that simple and familiar. That is how a man keeps going, he said. Ayana tilted her head just enough to glance at him. And here? She asked. Ethan let out a faint breath, something close to a quiet laugh, but without humor. Here, it feels like standing still, he admitted. Ayana shook her head once, slow, deliberate. No, she said. Here is where you see where you have been. The words settled into him deeper than he expected, because they did not challenge what he knew. They expanded it, stretched it into something he had not considered before. He finally turned his head slightly, looking at her from the corner of his eye. And if I ride out now? He asked. Ayana met his gaze fully, steady as ever. Then you carry what you saw, she said. Ethan's grip on the reins tightened just a fraction, enough for him to feel it. And if I stay? He asked. She did not hesitate this time. Then you learn what it asks of you. The difference between the two hung there, clear, undeniable, and for a moment, Ethan felt the weight of it settle into his chest, not as pressure, but as truth. He looked back at the horse, then at the land, then down at his own hand holding the reins, and slowly, without thinking about it too much, he loosened his grip. The leather slipped slightly in his fingers, not falling, but no longer held the same way. He reached into his pocket then, pulling out the stone, turning it once in the light, and for a brief second, he considered placing it on the saddle, leaving it behind as something that belonged to this place, something that did not need to follow him into the rest of his life. But his hand did not move that way. It stayed where it was, holding it, not tight, not loose, just certain. You said it does not belong to me, he said quietly. Ayana nodded. It does not belong to you alone. Ethan looked at it again, then closed his fingers around it. Then maybe it is not meant to be left behind either, he said. Ayana did not answer, but something in her expression shifted, not approval, not surprise, just a quiet acknowledgement that he had stepped into understanding on his own. The wind moved across the open land, carrying dust and light and the faint sound of distance, and Ethan felt it against his face, the same wind he had ridden through countless times before, but it did not feel the same now. It felt like something he was returning to, not escaping into. He stepped back from the horse then, just one step, but it was enough to break the line between leaving and staying, enough to make the choice real without needing to say it out loud. The horse shifted slightly, then settled again, as if it understood in its own way that the journey had not ended. It had simply changed direction. Ethan turned back toward the camp, the fires now dim. In the morning light, the people moving through their day with the same quiet rhythm, and he realized something that had been building since the river, something that had followed him through the night, and into this moment. He had spent years riding to find a place where nothing followed him, where every mile erased what came before. But now he stood at the edge of a place that did not need to hold him to matter, because it had already given him something that would not fade with distance. He took another step, this time toward the camp, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, and Ayana watched him without a word. Because there was nothing left to explain, the choice had been made. In the only way that mattered, not spoken, not declared, but carried in the direction a man chose to walk when no one was telling him where to go. He did not rush back, and that was the clearest sign the decision had settled into him, not as something forced, but as something chosen. Each step toward the camp felt measured, steady, like a man walking into his own thoughts instead of away from them. And the ground beneath his boots seemed different now, not softer, not harder, just known in a way it had not been before. The morning had fully taken hold, the light stretching across the land, catching the edges of the lodges, the slow movement of people beginning their day, and none of it stopped for him. None of it shifted to mark his return, and that made it feel more real than any grand welcome ever could. He passed by a small fire where an older man was tending embers, and without looking up, the man moved a piece of wood slightly to make space, not offering it, not asking, just leaving it there, and Ethan understood the gesture without needing it explained. A place could be given without being announced. He slowed near the center of the camp, not searching for Ayana this time, not looking for direction, just letting himself stand where he was, letting the moment settle without needing to name it. His hand brushed against his pocket again, the stone still there, and he realized he had not once thought about putting it down since he turned back from the trail. That alone told him more than any words could. A young woman passed him carrying water, her steps light but certain, and as she moved by, she gave a small nod, not lingering, not expecting anything in return, just acknowledging him the same way one might acknowledge the presence of a tree or a fire, something that belonged without needing to explain why. Ethan nodded back without thinking, and that simple exchange felt more natural than it should have. He let out a slow breath, looking around, taking in the way everything moved without needing to be directed, and for the first time, he did not feel like he was watching something separate from himself. He felt like he was standing inside it. You came back. Ayana's voice reached him from his right, not surprised, not questioning, just stating what was already clear. Ethan glanced toward her, then back out at the camp. Seems like I never really left, he replied. She stepped closer, stopping beside him, her presence steady as ever. That is how it works, she said quietly. He nodded once, not because he fully understood, but because he no longer needed to. There was a pause then, not empty, but open, like a space waiting for something to take shape, and Ethan found himself speaking before he had fully formed the thought. You said I would learn what it asks of me, he said. Ayana tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the words. Yes. Ethan shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as he looked out across the camp. So what does it ask? He asked. This time, she did not answer right away, and the silence stretched longer than before, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, like she was letting the question settle into him before giving it back. Finally, she said, it does not ask with words. Ethan let out a faint breath, something close to a quiet laugh. That sounds about right, he said. Ayana's gaze moved across the people, the fires, the movement of the day beginning. Watch, she said simply. Ethan followed her gaze, letting his eyes move across the camp without searching for anything specific, and slowly, piece by piece, he began to see what she meant, not in a single moment, but in a series of small ones. A man repairing a worn strap on a saddle, taking his time, not because it needed to be perfect, but because it mattered. A woman teaching a child how to carry water without spilling, her hands guiding without taking over. Two elders sitting in quiet conversation, not speaking much, but listening, in a way that held weight. None of it was dramatic, none of it stood out on its own, but together, it formed something that did not need to be explained, something that simply was. Ethan felt it then, not as a thought, but as a shift, a recognition that what had happened at the river had not ended there. It had moved forward, into this place, into these people, into him. It asks you to stay aware, Ayana said after a moment, her voice low, steady. Not just of danger, not just of what might take something from you, but of what you choose to give, even when no one is watching. The words settled into him deeper than anything else she had said, because they did not challenge what he knew. They expanded it. They turned something he had always done for survival into something that carried meaning beyond that. He looked down at his hands, at the lines still faint on his skin, at the calluses built from years of work, and for a moment, he saw them differently, not just as tools for getting through another day, but as something that could shape more than his own path. And if I fail at that? He asked, not out of doubt, but out of honesty. Ayana met his gaze, her expression unchanged. Then you learn, she said. There was no judgment in it, no expectation of perfection, just a simple truth that did not need to be softened. Ethan nodded slowly, the answer settling into him without resistance, because it did not demand anything he did not already understand in his own way. The sun climbed higher, the light growing stronger, and the camp moved with it, the rhythm of the day taking shape without needing to be announced. Ethan stood there, no longer at the edge, no longer deciding whether to stay or go, but simply present, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, that felt like enough. He reached into his pocket again, pulling out the stone, turning it once in the light, then closing his hand around it, not as a question, not as a choice, but as something already decided in a way that did not need words. Ayana watched him for a moment, then gave a small nod, not approving, not confirming, just acknowledging what had already taken place. And in that quiet exchange, Ethan understood something that would follow him long after he left this place, something that did not need to be spoken to be true. Sometimes a man does not change by leaving everything behind. Sometimes he changes by finally standing still long enough to see what has been waiting for him all along. The day carried on without pause. And that was what made everything feel real, because nothing stopped to mark what had changed inside him. Nothing slowed or shifted to acknowledge it. The world simply continued, and Ethan found himself moving with it, not as a man passing through, but as someone beginning to understand where he stood. He spent the morning working beside a man repairing a fence line near the edge of the camp, not because anyone told him to, not because it was expected, but because the work was there and his hands knew what to do. The wood was worn, the bindings needed tightening, and as he worked, the rhythm came back to him, familiar, steady, something he could rely on. But there was a difference now, subtle, quiet. The way each movement felt connected to more than just the task itself. The man beside him did not speak much, only nodding once when Ethan joined him, and that was enough. The kind of understanding that did not need words to hold it together. The sun climbed higher, the heat settling in, and sweat traced down Ethan's back as he worked. But he did not mind it, because for once, the effort did not feel like something he was doing alone. After a while, the man handed him a piece of rope, worn but strong, and Ethan took it, looping it through the wood with practiced hands, pulling it tight until it held firm. He tested it once, then stepped back, and the man nodded again. A small acknowledgement, but it carried weight. You fix things the same way you ride, the man said finally, his voice low, steady. Ethan glanced at him, slightly surprised by the words. How is that? He asked. The man shrugged lightly, his eyes still on the fence. You do not rush, and you do not leave it halfway. Ethan let out a quiet breath, something settling in him at that. Not pride, not quite, but recognition. That is how it holds, he said. The man nodded once more, then turned back to his work, and the conversation ended there, not because there was nothing more to say, but because nothing more was needed. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, looking at the fence, then at his hands, the calluses, the lines, the marks that had built up over years, and he realized that for the first time, he was not measuring what he had done by how quickly he could move on from it, but by how well it stayed. He wiped his hands on his pants, then stepped back, his eyes moving across the camp again, seeing it differently now, not as a place he had entered, but as a place he had begun to understand. A group of children ran past, their laughter light, cutting through the steady rhythm of the day, and one of them paused briefly, looking up at Ethan with that same quiet recognition he had seen before, then ran on without a word. Ethan watched them go, then shook his head slightly, a faint smile touching his face for just a second before fading again. You are starting to see it. Ayana's voice came from behind him, not close, but clear. He turned slightly, meeting her gaze. Starting, he said, the word carrying more weight than it sounded. She stepped closer, her eyes steady as ever. That is enough for now, she replied. Ethan nodded once, not because he was finished, but because he understood that this was not something that finished quickly. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the stone again, turning it once in his hand, the surface catching the light. Simple, unchanged, but somehow different every time he looked at it. It still feels strange, he said quietly. Ayana looked at the stone, then back at him. It should, she answered. He let out a slow breath, closing his hand around it again. Out there, he said, nodding toward the distant hills. Nothing stays this way. Things get worn down, forgotten, left behind. Ayana followed his gaze briefly, then returned her attention to him. That is because, out there, you are always moving away, she said. Ethan frowned slightly, considering that. And here? He asked. She tilted her head just enough, her voice steady. Here, you stay long enough to understand what remains. The words settled into him deeper than before. Because they did not challenge his past, they gave it context, a way to see it without needing to change it. He looked down at his hands again, then back at the fence they had repaired, the rope tight, the wood steady, and for a moment, he felt something he had not expected, not satisfaction, not exactly, but something quieter, something that did not fade the second the work was done. I used to think staying meant getting stuck, he said after a while, his voice thoughtful. Ayana watched him closely. And now? She asked. Ethan glanced around, at the camp, the people, the work continuing without needing to be directed, then back at her. Now it feels like the only way to know what matters, he said. She did not smile, did not nod, but something in her expression shifted just enough to show she understood. The wind moved through the camp again, carrying dust and warmth, and Ethan felt it against his skin, familiar, but no longer something he simply passed through. He slipped the stone back into his pocket, his hand lingering there for a moment before falling to his side. And he realized something that had been building since the night before, something that had followed him through every step, every word, every quiet moment. He was no longer deciding whether to stay or leave. He was learning what it meant to remain, even when the road was still there waiting for him. And as he stood there, in the middle of a place that had not asked him to change, but had shown him how, Ethan Cole understood that the hardest part was not choosing a direction. It was choosing to carry what he had found no matter where that direction led him next. The afternoon settled into something slower, not fading, not ending, just deepening. And Ethan found himself walking without a clear direction, not because he was lost, but because for once he did not need to know exactly where he was going. The camp moved around him in quiet rhythm, the same steady pattern he had begun to recognize, and he passed through it without interrupting it, without feeling like an outsider stepping into something that did not belong to him. A group of elders sat beneath a stretched shade, their voices low, measured, not in debate, not in instruction, just sharing. Something that did not need to be raised to be heard. And as Ethan passed, one of them lifted his gaze briefly, meeting Ethan's eyes with that same calm acknowledgement he had come to understand, then returning to the conversation without pause. Ethan slowed, not stopping, just letting the moment settle, because there was something in that exchange that felt important, not because it demanded attention, but because it did not. He continued on, the ground warm beneath his boots, the air carrying the dry scent of dust and sun, and for a moment, he realized he was not counting time, not measuring how long he had been here or how long he might stay. He was simply moving through it. He reached the far side of the camp where the land opened again, not the same place he had stood that morning, but close enough to see the stretch of hills beyond, and he paused there, looking out, not with the same pull to leave, but with something quieter, something that felt like understanding the distance. Without needing to cross it, his hand moved to his pocket again, the stone still there, and he pulled it out, holding it in the light, turning it slowly, the same way he had done before, but now the motion felt different, not uncertain, not searching, just familiar. You keep checking if it is still there. Ayana's voice came from behind him, steady, close enough to feel without needing to turn. Ethan glanced at the stone, then back out at the land. Not checking, he said, Just making sure. I do not forget it is real. Ayana stepped beside him, her gaze following his. It will not let you forget, she said. Ethan nodded slightly, the truth in that settling easily now, without resistance. There was a pause then, the kind that had become familiar, not empty, but holding something between them, and after a moment, Ethan spoke again. You said this stays where it was made, he said, his voice thoughtful. But the knowing follows. Ayana nodded once. Yes. Ethan turned the stone, again in his hand, watching the light catch on its surface. Feels like it is more than knowing, he admitted. Ayana glanced at him, her expression steady. It is, she said. But you do not name it yet. Ethan let out a faint breath, something close to a quiet laugh. That seems to be how everything works here, he said. Ayana's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. It works whether you name it or not, she replied. The wind shifted again, moving across the open land, and Ethan felt it brush against his face, carrying with it the same sense of distance he had known all his life. But now it did not call to him the same way. It did not pull him forward. It simply existed, something he could step into when the time came, but not something he needed to follow right now. He slipped the stone back into his pocket, his hand lingering there for a moment before falling to his side, and he realized that the urge to leave had not disappeared. It had changed. It had become something he could choose instead of something that drove him. There will be a time you ride out again, Ayana said, her voice low, not questioning, not suggesting, just stating something that was already understood. Ethan nodded, because that part of him had not gone. It had not been replaced, only reshaped. I know, he said. Ayana watched him for a moment, then added, when that time comes, you will see differently. Ethan glanced at her, then back at the land. And what if I do not? He asked, not challenging, just asking. Ayana held his gaze, her eyes steady. Then you will be reminded, she said. The certainty in her voice did not feel like a warning. It felt like a truth that had already proven itself. Ethan nodded slowly, the words settling into him, without resistance, because he could feel it, the way something had already changed in how he saw, how he stood, how he chose to move. He looked back toward the camp then, the fires now low, the movement steady, the people continuing their day without pause, and he understood something that had been building quietly since the moment he stepped into this place. This was not something that would hold him here forever. It was not meant to replace the life he had lived. It was meant to become part of it, something that would follow him without needing to be carried in his hands. You do not belong here, he said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. Ayana raised an eyebrow slightly, not offended, not surprised. No, she said. Ethan nodded once. And I do not belong here either, he added. Ayana's expression did not change, but her gaze sharpened just slightly. Not in the way you think, she said. Ethan looked at her, then back at the camp, then out at the land, and for a moment, the thought settled in him fully, not as a question, but as an understanding. Belonging was not about staying. It was about what remained when you left. He let out a slow breath, the weight in his chest no longer pressing down, but holding steady, like something he could carry without it breaking him. The sun dipped slightly, the light softening just enough to signal the day would not last forever, and Ethan stood there, between the camp and the open land, no longer caught between leaving and staying, but standing in a place where both could exist at the same time, and in that quiet balance, he understood that whatever came next would not be about choosing one world over the other. It would be about carrying both, without losing what had been given to him in the space between. The lights softened as the day leaned toward evening again, not in a rush, not in a hurry to end, but in the same quiet way everything here seemed to move, steady, certain, and Ethan stood where the land met the camp, feeling the balance settle into him, not as a choice anymore, but as something he had already stepped into. He did not look back at Ayana right away, did not need to, because her presence was no longer something he searched for. It was something he understood, like the fire, like the wind, like the ground beneath his boots. The air carried a warmth that would fade soon, and the shadows stretched long again across the earth, tracing the shapes of the people, the lodges, the paths worn by footsteps that did not wander without purpose. Ethan reached into his pocket once more, pulling out the stone, turning it slowly in his hand as he had done so many times since the night before. But now the movement felt different, not searching, not measuring, just remembering. He looked down at it, the surface catching the last of the sun, simple, worn, unchanged, and yet it held more weight than anything he had carried across miles of open land. You will leave before the next sun sets, Ayanna said behind him, her voice calm, certain, not asking, not suggesting, just stating what already belonged to the path ahead. Ethan nodded slightly, not turning yet, his eyes still on the stone. Yeah, he said quietly. I can feel that. There was no resistance in his voice, no hesitation, only acknowledgement, because the road had not disappeared. It had only been waiting. Ayanna stepped closer, stopping beside him once more, her gaze moving from the stone in his hand to the land beyond. And when you do, she said, you will not come back the same way. Ethan let out a faint breath, something like a quiet understanding settling deeper into his chest. I do not think I could, he admitted. The silence that followed was not empty. It held the weight of everything that had been said and everything that had not needed to be. Ethan slipped the stone back into his pocket, not as a decision, not as a symbol, just as something that belonged there now without question. He looked out across the hills again, the fading light tracing the lines of distance, and for the first time, the road did not feel like an escape. It felt like a continuation. Back out there, he said slowly. People will not see any of this. Ayanna nodded once, her expression unchanged. They will see what you choose to show them, she replied. Ethan frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in thought. And if I do not show anything? He asked. Ayanna turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. Then they will still feel it, she said. The certainty in her voice did not leave room for doubt, and Ethan felt it settle into him the same way everything else had, not forced, not demanded, just placed where it needed to be. He looked down briefly, then back at her. You make it sound simple, he said. Ayanna's lips curved just slightly, that familiar almost smile. It is not simple, she said. It is quiet. The words stayed with him longer than he expected, because they did not ask him to be something different. They asked him to be aware of what he already was. The camp behind them moved with the same steady rhythm, the fires beginning to glow again as the light faded, voices low, steps measured, nothing calling attention to itself. And Ethan realized that this place would continue the same way whether he stayed or left. It did not depend on him, and that made what he carried from it even more real. He shifted his stance slightly, turning just enough to face both the camp and the open land, no longer between them, but connected to both. And for a moment, he simply stood there, letting the last of the day settle into him. When I ride out, he said after a while, his voice steady. I am not leaving this behind. Ayanna did not nod, did not confirm, because she did not need to. The truth of it was already clear. No, she said quietly. You are taking it with you. Ethan let out a slow breath, the weight in his chest no longer heavy, no longer something he had to push against, but something that held him upright, something that gave shape to the road ahead instead of taking it away. He looked at the horizon one last time as the sun slipped below it, the sky deepening into that familiar wide darkness he had known all his life. But now it did not feel empty. It felt full, not crowded, not overwhelming, just filled with something he could not see but knew was there. He turned back toward the camp, not to stay, not to linger, but to take in one last quiet moment of it. The fires, the people, the steady rhythm that had shown him something he had not known he was missing. And then he looked forward again, toward the land that had always been his. And, for the first time, it did not feel like something he had to face alone. Because out here, a man could ride for miles and never say a word, could pass through towns and leave no trace, could live a life that never stopped long enough to understand what it meant. But now, Ethan Cole carried something different, something that did not need to be seen to matter, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And as the last light faded and the first stars returned, he stood therein, the quiet, knowing that when he rode out at first light, the road would still be the same, the miles would still stretch as far as they ever had, but the man riding it would not.